and gentlemen, good afternoon. And to Rilian, Shadmai, and Brown Da. Thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me and allowing me to address you on this rather complex issue relating to climate change. I want to approach it not as a scientist, quite obviously, but as a lawyer, and to address all the evidence that seems to be available and all the arguments have been put for and against the narrative that we hear every day. I do so with some trepidation, recalling the quotation by Dick the Butcher at Shakespeare's Henry IV, where he said, "The first thing we need to do is kill all the lawyers." So I approach the subject carefully, and I think the ways to approach it really is to address the situation that is presented to us on a daily basis, almost. The reasons why I started looking into this problem and showing some interest was that pre the pandemic period, I'd heard so much in newspapers and on the TV and other organs that there was this global warming, that it was all settled, there can be no debate, and there was a consensus, and indeed there was a young lady who came onto the scene and was presented as some form of saint, addressing the United Nations and other things, and I must say that it struck me that this didn't seem very scientific, and it struck me as more being a political movement with religious overtones. So I therefore thought it was desirable to investigate and research some of the information more closely, which I did in the lockdown period to take up some time. So what is this narrative? Let's assume that this is the plaintiff's case. The narrative that's been put to us is as follows, and I've just more or less set it out, but it is that the world is warming to an alarming degree, and that this warming is caused by CO2 emissions caused in the main by humankind, and that we need to do something about it urgently. It also came about that in the early stages, about the time of Al Gore, that it was stated that everything had been agreed. 97% of all scientists are now agreed that this is a definite fact that the world is warming due to the emissions of CO2, commonly known as AGW, anthropogenic global warming. So we look at this narrative and see what is happening. First of all, the consensus. Consensus is not a scientific word. Science is a process. It's a constant process. It's always ongoing. So it's a bit unlikely to have a consensus because there's always somebody who's coming along, testing theories, verifying them, and it's a constant process. Therefore, very unwise to close the door and say it's all agreed. 97% of all scientists is a very high margin. I beg to differ on this. It seems indeed that the surveys on which this figure was obtained were in themselves flawed. That has been debated by other scientists who have examined the evidence, and indeed Lord Monckton has said so, and examined the surveys. The problem with surveys is it does depend on the questions that are put to you. It may be that out of the group within the survey, some don't even bother to reply because they don't think it's relevant to what they're doing. And that was the case in this instance, that of, say, the 100 people that responded, maybe about 60% didn't even bother to reply, but the percentage was still taken on the whole rather than on the ones that did reply. So there was a flawed survey, but even if that wasn't the case, in science it doesn't really matter, because there's always one person who can be right and all the others wrong. This has happened with Galileo and Einstein, where the established scientific field was covered by people who thought they were so totally wrong, and they turned out to be the people that were right and the establishment wrong. So it's a very dangerous thing, I think, when you're putting forward a proposition which has so many implications, to state that 97% of scientists all agree. And then moving on, that the science is all settled. And that is being put out on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, that it's all settled. Most of these scientists agree, and we must take immediate action. Well, if you research, and the research has to go outside the normal field of TV and the press, you will find on the internet and in other fields, looking out for books and other means of research, that there are any number of eminent scientists who disagree. This is despite the fact that they are called deniers, heretics, and people who are best ignored because they're ignorant and flat earthers. This is not the case at all. There are eminent scientists like Dr. Richard Lindzen, Patrick Moore, the co-founder of Greenpeace, William Happer, and I could go on and on, of many, many eminent scientists who do not agree with this narrative, which is that global warming will eventually come to a point at which we'll all burn or something dreadful will happen and that we must take immediate action. Of course, the denier element is, again, an indication of a rather religious overtone that people seem to have taken in this field. It remains to say that this has been taken up by, it appears, most of the governments of the world, and in this country certainly all the TV recognised territorial channels and most of the press. There have been odd comments and doubts expressed, but broadly speaking it's all been accepted. And we are now rushing ahead in this country into a situation where we're going to spend trillions of pounds. I think 1.7 trillion has been mentioned, and I understand that that is now an estimate. So we're going to be spending much, much money on this situation. So let's examine it a bit more closely. The genre of this situation, of climate change started in the 70s to mid-80s, when the fears were of global cooling, that we were approaching an ice age. I think Richard Burton himself bought a house in Mexico in order to avoid the worst effects of this. And there were many more who were extremely worried about what may happen to the world. At that stage, the question of CO2 emissions was not raised as a topic or as a reason for this. We then moved, though, into the 80s to 90s period, up to 1980s to 1980, when global warming was raised. This was initially started by Al Gore with his great film of The Inconvenient Truth. And I'll say something more about that in a moment. And then, though, in 1998, the phraseology changed for a while. It changed from global warming to climate change. This was at a time when the temperature paused, ceased to rise, and then plateaued, so the increases were smaller. It has recently come back to global warming to quite a degree, but that's the history of it. Now it's worth looking at, where did this all start and what was it all about? Well, let's look at the CO2 emissions argument at the moment. There is a debate in scientific circles about the question of the CO2 emissions and whether they have indeed caused climate change or global warming. CO2 has been with us for some considerable time, and it's worth saying that it is a wonderful, wonderful part of our planet. This is the food of life. CO2 is absolutely essential and beneficial to agricultural, trees and plants. Indeed, in the last, say, 20 years, it has been shown by satellite that the planet has got greener and greener. The reason for that is that, of course, with increased CO2, plants don't require so much water. The CO2 to some extent compensates for that. And therefore the areas of the planet which originally were suffering have started to green up. So it's worth putting the fact forward that CO2 is good, it is beneficial. Now let's look at the negative side which is portrayed. That says that CO2 emissions cause the temperature to rise to such a degree that we are in danger, extreme danger. It is that extremity which is now causing people to say, if we don't do something immediately, within a short space of time, say within the next 10 years, we will be doomed. We will be doomed. As the gentleman in the famous TV program kept saying, we are doomed. Well, are we? Is it a cause? It is certainly a fact that the temperatures are rising at the same time as CO2 are rising. But that is not a cause, that is correlation.